Good morning. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. Filling in for Jonathan Capehart, I'm Leanne Caldwell, anchor at Washington Post Live and co-author of the Early Brief newsletter. We have a lot to get to today regarding the Republican National Convention, which concluded last evening with a speech from Donald Trump, which was the longest speech in convention history. He beat his own speech record in 2020. This speech coming in at about 93 minutes. We have a lot to get to, as I said, and we're going to start with my colleague, Mariana Sotomayor, who spent the entire week in Milwaukee and is still there. Mariana, so good to see you this morning.
Good to see you too.
Mariana, we were there together all week, not only covering this convention, but also writing the newsletter, the early brief. I got out last night. I hope you're able to get out today with this technical glitch, computer technical glitch, which is causing lots of problems. But anyway, want to start with the speech last night at the convention. His final speech was, or his final night of the convention theme was Make America Great Again, of course. There was a lot of speculation that he was going to show this softer side of Donald Trump, especially after the assassination attempt last weekend. Talk to us about that speech and what sort of message Donald Trump managed to convey.
Yeah, Trump actually started off his speech pointing out that he wants to be a president that represents all Americans. That was pretty significant given how divisive he has been in the past, how divisive his rhetoric has been. So he did start off setting that tone. However, later on in the speech, he did go very much off script. I think that did contribute to the fact that he went on for over an hour, a little over an hour and a half. And it was at that point that many of our colleagues who cover Trump on a daily basis were saying he's going into his usual stump speech on the campaign trail. And it was a little bit more of that inflammatory rhetoric. But I should say before that Trump did take time at the beginning of his speech to talk about that assassination attempt. It was, of course, the first time that many of us have heard from him, though we had seen him the days prior. Since that assassination attempt, he talked about that at length. There were many people in the crowd who were very sympathetic to him, and then he started to talk about all of the issues that we've heard him talk about for several years. Very critical of the Biden administration, though he only had mentioned Biden once during the speech by name, and then he really got into discussing immigration, the number of undocumented migrants who were coming into the country. He even made a point for quite a while that murders in South America were going down because the murderers were coming into the U.S. So it was that kind of red meat, inflammatory rhetoric that he often uses, that he used for quite a long time last night. There were a number of our colleagues who were on the convention floor who once Trump started riffing for a little too long, they saw a number of supporters leave or make comments about, man, he should wrap this up. It's something that I heard later on in the evening from delegates. And all in all, though, it was a very unified Republican Party. I know you and I heard from both elected officials and delegates say that this was the first time they really felt unity and behind a Republican candidate. Some who said they haven't felt that since 2004, and others said who haven't felt that since the Reagan era.
One thing that was noticeably missing from this speech, and really throughout the convention, was talk about January 6th. There was not a lot of mention about abortion. There was not a lot of talk about what Trump likes to riff on constantly on the campaign trail, about where he lies about winning the 2020 election, as he falsely claims to do so pretty much every time he speaks. Was it notable, and why do you think that those themes were mostly absent, even though they are so central to why he is running again?
It was incredibly notable. We actually heard those, claims of the stolen election really only last night. We heard it first from Tucker Carlson, and then Trump, just briefly again off script, made mention or the suggestion that Democratic officials, they don't really work very hard except when it comes to rigging the election. So it was one of those moments where a lot of our ears perked up when he said that, because we hadn't heard that kind of rhetoric. And listen, the convention did a good job of not just only projecting unity, but trying to diversify the speakers, diversify the party, show that the Republican Party is becoming what many lawmakers, I know you and I have heard this many a time, the Republican Party is a big tent party. And they really tried to display that by the number of speakers that they had, a lot of women, a lot of Black and Hispanic lawmakers and delegates and representatives throughout the country coming up and speaking. Everyday Americans was a daily theme of people who were spotlighted for what they have gone through, whether it was this mother, it was several days ago, a mother who lost her son to fentanyl. That was a very moving moment and really did cross the political boundaries, right? Didn't I think she even mentioned at the point, doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat, this is an issue and it's affecting many of us. So there were, of course, moments that definitely riled up the Republican base. I mean, you and I have heard from lawmakers years after year that though they might privately not like Trump, they still very much embrace him and his policies because of that very fervent base. And that base was very much present throughout the week.
Since you're on the theme of unity, I want to play a clip from last night that gets at Donald Trump trying to be a unifying candidate. Let's listen.
The discord and division in our society must be healed. We must heal it quickly. As Americans, we are bound together by a single fate and a shared destiny. We rise together or we fall apart. I am running to be president for all of America, not half of America, because there is no victory in winning for half of America.
So, Mariana, as we know, that has been a theme in many conventions before, including Barack Obama's famous 2004 speech when he says that he does not want to be or he wants to be for there's not a red America and a blue America, there's just the United States of America. But that is not a theme that we have heard a lot in Donald Trump conventions. Was it effective? And what's your take?
It'll be interesting to see if it was effective, right? Because we were among lawmakers, delegates who already really embraced Trump. So, of course, if you asked them, they said, yes, he's trying to represent all of Americans. There was only, I think, another time in the speech where Trump made direct mention of bringing in the Democratic Party or Democratic voters to the Republican base. So there's very much been this feeling of let's try and grow the party, especially at a time when the Democratic Party is going through its own intra-party battles. But, to your earlier point, Trump does have a history of inflammatory rhetoric, does have a history of playing down the insurrection that happened on January 6th at the Capitol. And this is a base that has followed along with that. So this was really a speech, and it was notable. He only mentioned, representing all of America or trying to bring in Democratic voters very, very little in his hour and a half speech last night. This is something that if he really is going to try and embrace that, I mean, we'll see if he continues to say that on the campaign trail. He has some time to maybe convince some voters that he will no longer be just the representative of this Trump base.
Yeah, it's a far cry from a normal Donald Trump, right? I want to ask you about JD Vance. What sort of what is Welcome back. Sorry about those technical difficulties. I'm not quite sure what happened on my end. Mariana, you're still there. Thank you. But what I was asking you when I got disconnected is I want to talk about JD Vance. What does Senator JD Vance of Ohio, 39 years old, what does he bring to this ticket? And what does it mean for potentially another Trump presidency?
Yeah, so a theme that was pretty notable throughout the week was this kind of redemption tour by a number of Republicans who were critical of Trump, who were never Trumpers. And there's no one who was more emblematic of a change, right, than Senator Vance. I mean, he has been probably one of Trump's sharpest critics before he ran for office. And he really, though, has always stuck to, and he wrote a whole book about populism. How do you appeal to people like him who grew up poor, who grew up with a mother with addiction, who grew up with a lot of instability? And that is part of his own story arc, as much as it is that he went from an anti Trump guy to now being Trump's vice president. We have seen that evolution when he ran for office, now on Capitol Hill. And there's been a number of at least elected lawmakers who have pointed out the fact that he has not served in office for a long time. So there's not, in their opinion, too much to necessarily tarnish his image. And something that I know you and I have been discussing with a number of Republicans is the fact that, Trump could have chosen, for example, Marco Rubio, and many people could have seen the senator bringing in more Latino voters to the Republican Party. JD Vance really only just enhances that MAGA brand, but he does add that tone of populism. And I believe it was either Donald Trump Jr. or Eric Jr. who brought up the fact that, both of these men, former President Donald Trump and also Senator Vance, they just grew up very differently. They experienced America differently, but together they can bring this new vision, more representation of the country. So, we have seen Vance be a bulldog for Donald Trump. And that is something that Trump very much appreciates, someone who is defensive. And he also appreciates those people who, may at one time have been super critical of him, but now have turned around and kissed the ring. So I think what you'll see in Vance is obviously a much younger, enthusiastic defender of Trump. And he could potentially be someone that continues to carry that MAGA mantle after, whatever happens in November, whether Trump wins or loses the election.
Mariana, we are out of time. I wanted so much to ask you about President Biden and what his weekend looks like and the pressure that he's getting, but I'm going to have to read all about it in the Washington Post over the weekend. Thank you so much. I hope you get home from Milwaukee safe, and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you. All I have to say about Democrats is stay tuned, developing minute by minute.
Great. And now we turn to our opinions columnists. We're going to speak with Megan McArdle and EJ Dion. Welcome to both of you.
Great to be with you, Leanne. Big fan of your work.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm a big fan of both of your guys' work so much. I love reading you, and I'm fascinated about your take about this convention this past week. Megan, let's start with you. There was, as we saw, broad speculation that Donald Trump had changed. The assassination attempt had brought forward a changed man. Did you see that last night?
I mean, you saw flashes of it. And in fact, yeah, I would say I did see a changed man, although not in quite the same way that perhaps we were hoping. Look, I mean, he's 78. This is not a time when people usually have like deep personal conversions. What I think you did see was that he seemed quite subdued. Even when he was launching into his somewhat amazing hour-long digression about his old grievances, he just seemed like he wasn't having fun. And that had always been a thing about Donald Trump, whether he was your cup of tea or not. He always looked like he was having fun up there. He was surfing the adulation of the crowd. And he just seemed a little bit tired, a little bit taken aback. He also did try to strike these conciliatory notes that are not notes we normally hear from Donald Trump. But of course, he couldn't hold on to that. He did still have to go into the grievances, into the lying Democrats, into the drill baby drill, all of the old stuff. But that actually, it's not that it felt insincere. It just felt like the passion had gone out. Look,
Mhm.
he's 78. He just got shot at. It was probably exhausting. You don't bounce back from stuff like that as like you did when you were 50. And I think that was probably a big part of that. But he did not seem like quite the man we're used to seeing on stage.
Yeah, yeah. Last night, he did give an account of what happened in Pennsylvania last weekend. He said he was only going to say it once because it's too painful to recount again. But let's listen to this, and then EJ, I'll talk to you on the other side.
In a certain way, I felt very safe because I had God on my side. I felt that. The amazing thing is that prior to the shot, if I had not moved my head at that very last instant, the assassin's bullet would have perfectly hit its mark, and I would not be here tonight. We would not be together.
EJ, what's your take on how much and often God was invoked by Donald Trump last night? We hear that often from Republicans and at Republican conventions, but usually not from Donald Trump. What do you think?
Well, I think some religious people get very nervous when people declare that they know that God is on their side. But I think among Trump's supporters, and you've written a lot about this, that he's got a very strong base now among conservative Christians, some Christian nationalists, some old garden variety conservatives, and I think they resonated very much to that language. And I think you're showing that clip was useful because you really had two parts of that speech last night. And the line that went through my head is a variation on the old one. You rarely get a second chance to make a new impression. And I think Trump lost an enormous opportunity to make a new impression. He kind of did that in the first part of the speech. It was much more reflective. He was telling a story about an extraordinary event, what happened to him, in a way that I think really did grab people. But as Megan suggested, he just couldn't stop himself, and he moved very quickly to the old stuff. But in a way, in that hour-long, diversion that created an hour-and-a-half-long speech, what he did is he had the old stuff but lower energy. I was also really struck by the way that Megan mentioned his age twice in what she talked about, and I think she's right about that. And given what we're talking about on the Democratic side, it's I think important that she underscored that point. The other thing is, I think if you think about the fight among Democrats, which we're going to get to about whether Biden should stay on the ticket or not, I think both sides got ammunition last night. If you were Joe Biden watching that long speech, you had to be saying to yourself, I can beat this guy. The side of the party that thinks that Biden should step down is going to look at that and say, we could really beat this guy with a younger candidate who didn't have the problems that Joe Biden is now facing. But mostly I felt this was an enormous lost opportunity for Trump. He sort of grabbed it at the beginning, and then he lost it and lost all discipline.
Yeah, as our colleague Mariana said, that delegates on the floor, even his biggest supporters, were starting to lose interest in that speech. Megan, I want to ask you about JD. Yeah, go ahead.
Could I just say our colleague David Von Traley had a comment last night. It got to the point where I thought he would say, folks, if you vote for me, I'll stop talking. That's not a good thing for somebody to be able to joke about in a convention speech.
Megan, I want to ask you about JD Vance. What does his nomination as VP mean for the future of the Republican Party?
Look, I think this is a nomination of a former president who is confident that he is going to win. I think that confidence is merited, frankly. I think even if Democrats nominate someone younger, as they should, it is going to be extremely difficult to stand up a campaign in just a few months to deal with the shortcomings of the vice president if she is the nominee, or to introduce a new candidate to the public if she is not. But because of that, this is a nominee that is not so much about balancing the ticket, bringing new voters in. It is about securing Trump's legacy within the Republican Party, solidifying the shift to MAGA, MAGA, MAGA forever, putting down the last remnants of the old guard. And I think that, he is young. He is capable of carrying this torch for many decades to come. And I certainly think he is going to give it his best shot. And he has a very good chance of doing so, given the total disarray that Democrats are in right now.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Mark Short, who was one of Mike Pence's top aides, told me this is a mini-me choice. So not a lot of difference between Trump and JD Vance. But EJ, does JD bring any sort of electoral benefit to Donald Trump?
Well, there's the theory of the case, I think, that the Trump people have, which is he talks all the time about the working class. There were parts of his speech that sounded almost left wing when he was talking about the ruling class and the left out. And the number of times that J.D. Vance mentioned the states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan just had the political strategy of the speech in subtitles, if you will, all the way through. So that's what they think he can bring. I think the problem, and again, if you listen to his speech, his views, particularly on issues like abortion and other social issues, Vance does Trump no good in that other really important swing group in those three states, which are suburban moderate voters, particularly women. And I don't think that he helps at all there. And so I agree with Megan. It's underscoring where Trump was going. I think there's a great mystery at the heart of the Trump-Vance ticket, which is, on the one hand, you've got Vance especially, but Trump did it some too, saying we are the champions of the working class. On the other hand, you have Trump constantly going out to business people saying, I'll deregulate the economy, I'll give you tax cuts. He made sure he was very animated for a rare moment last night when he talked about cutting taxes some more. And so they are making promises at both ends. And I think somebody's going to be disappointed at the end here if they actually win. And that's the mystery of this Republican Party, which is still, if you look at the congressional party, a merger of big business republicanism with this kind of new right populism.
It's so fascinating. EJ, I want to stick with you on President Biden. You were one of the people who early on wrote questioning President Biden's ability or capacity to run for re-election again. Do you think he should step aside?
I do. And for somebody like me, that was actually a kind of painful column to write. I've known Joe Biden for a very long time. I grew up in a mill town too. I very much admire and relate to his kind of labor sort of liberalism. But I think what you saw, not only in the debate, which raised the age question in a way I think it hadn't fully been raised before, for people who already thought he was too old, it underscored that. But for some of us who thought, well, the Biden who handled the State of the Union address can handle this campaign, it was a kind of shocker. And then they spent a week really not dealing with it well at all, not reaching out to leadership. And so I think at this point, and you're seeing this in the party itself, there were a lot of people in Congress, people I've talked to in the last week, who also really like Joe Biden, but say after that, it will be very hard for people to unsee what they saw in the debate, and that everything Biden does, even the little mistakes he makes that were really mistakes he made all his life that people kind of laughed off, that's Joe, they become problems now. So that's why I think you've developed a consensus in the party that he needs to find a way to say that I have seen something here that tells me what I'd rather do is spend my next 6 months completing my presidency and I think we should go forward with somebody else. Yesterday, the story was back and forth. It looked like he was moving that way. Then late in the day, there was some pushback from the Biden people. I still have a sense it's moving in the direction that Biden will leave. But on this story, it's gone back and forth for 3 weeks.
Right. It's been so fascinating. Megan, this past week at the convention, there was a lot of contrast. A theme was contrast between former President Trump's strength, that photo of his fist in the air with the American flag and his ear drenched with blood, compared to they would show clips of Biden tripping up the stairs with his stiff gait. So showing this like strength of Donald Trump compared to what they are perceiving as a weakness of Joe Biden. Was that effective?
Absolutely. And I think that if Joe Biden watched that speech and thought maybe I can beat this guy, he should think again. There is a dramatic contrast. Look, Trump is 78. He is slowing down. You can see it. He makes mistakes that I don't think he would have made 20 years ago, like confusing Nikki Haley with Nancy Pelosi. So he is not a spring chicken. And I think Democrats, I have seen this. I've been out talking about this for years now, and I've been getting a huge amount of pushback from Democrats, and I am still getting pushback. Why don't you talk about Trump's age? Why don't you talk about his meandering speech? His speech was meandering, and I think that probably does have something to do with age, but there is an enormous contrast between these two men. Donald Trump was going off his teleprompter constantly, and he was not doing what Joe Biden does, which is forget what he's saying halfway through, say anyway, and kind of trail off and change the subject. He is just stronger, more vigorous, and better able to prosecute a campaign. And in some ways, look, I'm not going to vote for the guy, but in some ways, better able to run the Oval Office than Joe Biden. And so, yes, I think this is a phenomenally fruitful line of attack for Republicans. It is going to continue as long as Joe Biden remains the nominee. And I think that this is a real issue that frankly, Democrats, I have been saying this for years, they should have seen this before. Every time these videos came out showing him looking basically like he does now, making mistakes that were sort of inexplicable, we got nonsense about his stutter. We got nonsense about cheap fakes. And too many people in the media, frankly, repeated that nonsense as if it were plausible. And I think that has led the Democrats to where they are today, where they are not able to go forward with this candidate and win. And it is probably, unfortunately, too late to select an alternative candidate and get that person across the finish line in November.
EJ, I want to ask you about that. Every single, Democrat I talk to, most Democrats I should say, they're extremely concerned, elected officials are concerned about Joe Biden and his ability to win. And then there's also concern about if Kamala Harris or a new candidate would also be able to win. So it's like, do you go with the risk that you have in front of you, or take a new risk and see what happens? What is this going to do to the party if Joe Biden does step aside?
Well, I think that the party takes a risk either way. And before, a lot of people in the party, I think Megan may be right that some of us fooled ourselves when we were looking at Biden before. Some of us just looked at evidence like the State of the Union and said, oh, he can do this. Well, it turns out this is more problematic than many people in the party thought. And I think right now the party is overwhelmingly on the side of it's worth taking the risk of a new candidate. I don't agree with Megan that this is impossible. On the contrary, I think that it's rare. When you look at the polls, Biden has not been all that strong anyway, even before this. Party rarely gets a chance to say, well, let's take another turn. I think there'd be enormous excitement in the party if they had a new candidate now. They've got themes in place against Trump. They've got organization on the ground. And by any other country's standards, it's still a long time between now and the election. I think a lot of it will depend, if Biden does indeed step down, on how they execute it. And I think there's a split there. A lot of Democrats say, well, let's just move on quickly to Kamala Harris. Anything else will create a lot of infighting. Other Democrats say, let's have a process. that looks democratic and not have it look like somebody's imposed on us. I think that if I were Kamala Harris, I think I would say, let's have an open process. And I think she could win it if she did that. And I think an open process that led to Kamala Harris is probably the outcome that is most unifying for the party.
Megan, throughout this Republican convention, a big theme was unity. I think it was more about uniting the Republican Party than it was about uniting the country, my take. But they did do a good job uniting the Republican Party. Nikki Haley was there. Ted Cruz spoke in a much different speech than in the 2016 campaign when he refused to endorse Donald Trump. And, there are other instances of former Trump opponents endorsing the president and speaking there. So taking that unified moment of the Republican Party after years of tumult in the party, and then now just in the last few weeks, a very united Democratic Party is now being ripped apart and completely divided over who should be if the president should be the nominee. How does the Democratic Party unite in the next 100 days before the election, or can they?
I think it's a big challenge. I agree with EJ that an open process is the right thing to do, although I think it for different reasons. My sense is, look, you have an enormous. First of all, like, you should be trying to select the most electable candidate, and far from clear to me that Kamala Harris is that person. She did not do well in the 2020 primaries, and I'm not a big fan of her campaigning skills, honestly. But I think the other reason to have an open process is that it draws attention to you, right? If it's just Kamala Harris, there's going to be a lot of, well, I've already seen that movie, I know what it looks like. If you have an open process, you're going to have people tuning in to see, following every day what the Democrats are doing, and that helps generate excitement. It helps introduce your candidate, and it helps take the focus off of Republicans and put it onto you, which they desperately need. I also think it's a moment where, look, you can argue whether it's fair or not that Joe Biden is getting blamed for things like inflation, but he is. And I think it is a moment where Democrats can maybe draw a little bit of a line between the inflation, other things that people are unhappy about, and say, no, but I'm going forward. Here's what I've done in my state. Here's what I've done as senator or whoever. I think it's probably going to be a governor unless it's Kamala Harris. But they can put themselves forward. They can draw that line. They can put the focus of the country on the Democratic Party, on a new young candidate who looks vigorous and is talking a lot and saying things that sound good. That's what the party needs right now. And so I think that if it would be a drastic mistake to just sort of coronate Kamala Harris and try to move into the convention. I understand the temptation to do that for a lot of reasons. And I think it does risk blowing the party open a little bit, but it helps unify the party with the public. And that's what they actually need come November.
EJ, very quickly, how important is it for President Biden, should he step aside, to be engaged in that process, the what comes next process?
I just want to make one point on unity in the party. There is one thing that absolutely still unites the party, which is the idea that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy and must be defeated. That's a very big thing. And what's funny is that brings both sides of the Biden argument together. Each side claims my choice is more likely to win the election. I think it's very tricky for President Biden. On the one hand, I think it would be hard for him to do anything else if he pulled out except to endorse Kamala Harris. And I think he would lean toward that. The other is, I'm not 100% sure that his strong endorsement of Harris and seeming to try to push her through would be the most helpful thing to her at the end of the process and in the general election. So I hope for the Democrats' sake that there are a lot of people, while we are waiting for the outcome of what President Biden is actually going to do, that they are thinking very carefully about the process, about what President Biden should say, how he should say it about Kamala Harris. I think the other interesting thing, by the way, is you could have an open process and you could have candidates like Governor Whitmer of Michigan and others saying that, I'm not going to run, Gavin Newsom. I'm not going to run this time. I'm going to support Kamala Harris. I think the people who have a future in the party are going to face a very difficult choice about whether they would jump in if there were an open process.
We are out of time. Thank you both for such a fascinating conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Megan McArdle and EJ Dion, thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
for having me.
And thank you all for joining us today on First Look. Jonathan Capehart should be back next Friday. For more of these important conversations, sign up for a Washington Post subscription. Get a free trial by visiting washingtonpost.com/live. That's washingtonpost.com/live. I'm Leanne Caldwell. Have a great weekend.